At 11:47 p.m. on December 24, 1944, Corporal James "Jimmy" Hartwell crouched in a frozen forward observation post 800 meters from the German lines in the Hürtgen forest, watching 73 enemy soldiers through his scope as snow fell in heavy, muffling curtains. His right hand gripped a battered harmonica wrapped in medical tape, an instrument he'd been practicing with obsessively for 3 months, despite explicit orders from Captain Morris to stop that goddamn racket. The nearest Allied artillery battery sat 4 kilometers behind him, across a valley the Germans had zeroed with mortars, making any conventional fire support a minimum 12-minute response time, an eternity in close combat. In approximately 90 seconds, Hartwell would begin playing Silent Night through a field telephone connected to German communication lines, and in 6 minutes, the entire enemy platoon would believe they were being flanked by a full company. This is the story of how an unremarkable supply clerk from Ohio used music, psychology, and a stolen Wehrmacht radio manual to accomplish what 3 weeks of artillery bombardment could not. The night was crystalline with cold. Hartwell's breath came in controlled puffs, each exhalation a potential giveaway in the acoustic deadness of fresh snow. Through the scope of his M1903 Springfield, a rifle he wasn't even supposed to have in a forward position, he counted the Germans again. 73. He'd counted them 11 times in the past hour, and the number never changed. They were dug in along a ridge that commanded the entire approach to Bergstein, a nothing village that had somehow become the hinge point for the entire Hürtgen offensive. Behind him, hidden in a depression that provided cover from everything except a direct mortar hit, Private Eddie Kowalski lay with his ear pressed to a field radio, monitoring 3 separate German frequencies. Next to him, Sergeant Frank Delaney, the only NCO who hadn't laughed Hartwell out of the command post when he'd first proposed this insanity, checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. 11:48, Delaney whispered, his voice barely audible, even at 3 feet. "You sure about this, Hartwell?" Hartwell didn't answer immediately. He was listening to something else, the quality of silence that existed between the lines. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have noticed it. 3 months ago, he was still hauling ammunition crates and requisition forms, the kind of soldier who appeared in exactly 0 after-action reports, and whose name would never be attached to anything more dramatic than a supply manifest. But 3 months ago, he hadn't yet discovered that the Germans were using a specific model of field telephone, the Feldfernsprecher 33, that operated on frequencies close enough to Allied equipment that, with the right modifications, you could not only listen in, but broadcast directly into their communication network. "I'm sure," Hartwell said finally. "They're singing." Delaney's head snapped up. "What?" "Listen." And there it was, carried on the wind from the German positions. Faint, but unmistakable. Voices raised in song. "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night." Hartwell felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature settle into his stomach. This was either going to be the most brilliant psychological operation of the war, or it was going to get a lot of men killed. Probably both. James Hartwell was 23 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and had never fired a weapon in combat until 4 weeks ago when a German patrol stumbled onto his supply depot and he'd managed to shoot 1 man before the rest retreated. He'd vomited immediately afterward, which his sergeant had charitably not mentioned in the report. He was from Dayton, Ohio, where his father worked at the National Cash Register Company factory, and his mother taught piano lessons to neighborhood children. Hartwell had graduated high school with unremarkable grades and worked as a grocery stock clerk before the draft found him. The Army, in its infinite systematic wisdom, had looked at his civilian experience with inventory management and assigned him to supply services. He'd arrived in Europe 3 months after day, was attached to the 28th Infantry Division, and had spent most of his time ensuring that ammunition, rations, and replacement parts moved from rear echelon depots to forward positions. Nobody expected genius from supply clerks. Nobody expected tactical innovation. What they expected was for the right number of mortar shells to arrive at the right place at approximately the right time, and for paperwork to be filed in triplicate. Hartwell had been fine with that. He had no illusions about being a warrior. He'd seen what happened to the men who came back from the line. The 1,000-yard stares, the shaking hands, the sudden violent reactions to loud noises. He'd helped load body bags onto trucks. He'd inventoried the personal effects of soldiers who'd been alive when he'd last delivered their ammunition. War, he'd concluded, was something to survive, not embrace. But Hartwell had one characteristic that set him apart from most supply clerks. He was pathologically curious about how things worked. As a child, he'd disassembled every appliance in his house until his father banned him from touching anything with moving parts. In the Army, he'd spent his downtime studying the technical manuals for every piece of equipment that crossed his depot. Not because he needed to, but because the engineering fascinated him, radio equipment especially. The moment that changed everything occurred on September 18, 1944, when a retreating American unit abandoned a damaged SCR-300 radio set at Hartwell's depot. The radio wasn't beyond repair, the vacuum tubes were intact, and only the antenna assembly was shattered. But the combat engineers who might have fixed it were all forward with the push into Germany. Hartwell spent 3 days rebuilding it, using parts cannibalized from 2 other damaged sets and a civilian radio he'd found in an abandoned farmhouse. When he finally got it working, he did what any curious technician would do. He started scanning frequencies. That's when he heard them. German voices, clear as day, speaking in a mixture of military jargon and casual conversation. A forward observation post reporting coordinates. A supply officer complaining about fuel shortages. A company commander ordering his men to hold position at all costs. Hartwell had studied German in high school, barely passing, but enough to follow basic conversation. He sat in his tent that night with a notebook, transcribing everything he heard, cross-referencing it with captured Wehrmacht equipment manuals he'd found in a box of intelligence materials that had been sitting in his depot for 2 months, unexamined. The manual for the Feldfernsprecher 33 was a revelation. The German field telephone operated on analog circuits that, due to wartime parts shortages, used frequency ranges that overlapped with American equipment. More importantly, the switching systems the Germans used were predictable, routing calls through central switchboards that connected multiple units in a communication net, which meant, theoretically, if you could access that net, you could broadcast to multiple German positions simultaneously. Hartwell brought his findings to his supply sergeant, who told him to stick to the counting crates. He brought them to a communications officer, who glanced at his notebook and said the intelligence section would look into it before dismissing him. He even tried to submit a formal report through channels, which vanished into the administrative void. Nobody wanted strategic advice from a supply clerk, especially not advice that sounded like something from a pulp spy novel. So Hartwell did what any frustrated innovator would do. He kept experimenting on his own time. He discovered that the Germans used specific call signs for different unit types. He mapped the communication nets for 3 separate regiments. He learned to distinguish between routine traffic and urgent tactical updates. He even figured out how to inject brief signals into the German network without being immediately detected. Short bursts that could be mistaken for atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. And then he had an idea so audacious, so psychologically manipulative, that even he thought it might be insane. What if you could use the German communication network against them? Not by feeding false orders, that would be detected immediately, but by creating psychological confusion, by making them believe something that their own senses would seem to confirm to. The idea crystallized in mid-November when Hartwell was delivering supplies to a forward observation post and overheard 2 combat-weary sergeants discussing the latest failed assault on the Hürtgen forest positions. The Germans held the high ground. They had interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was covered by machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery. American casualties were catastrophic. Entire companies reduced to squad strength in hours. "We need them to move," one sergeant had said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Just get them out of those goddamn bunkers for 5 minutes, and we could flank them. But they won't budge." That night, Hartwell sat in his tent with his modified radio and the Wehrmacht manual and began sketching out a plan. It would require precise timing. It would require knowing exactly how German tactical doctrine worked. It would require making the enemy believe they were facing a threat that didn't exist, and doing it in a way that seemed to come from their own command structure. It would also require something that had nothing to do with radio equipment. It would require music. The Hürtgen forest in December 1944 was a nightmare rendered in snow and pine trees. The forest stretched across 50 square miles of ridgelines, ravines, and thick coniferous growth that reduced visibility to meters. It was terrain that negated American advantages in armor and artillery while favoring German defensive tactics. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every depression could conceal a machine gun nest. The forest floor was a maze of mines, tripwires, and booby traps. By mid-December, the 28th Infantry Division had been fighting in the Hürtgen for 3 weeks and had advanced less than 4 kilometers at a cost of over 6,000 casualties. The division that entered the forest had numbered 14,000 men. The division that remained was a ghost of itself. Understrength companies, exhausted officers, and replacements arriving daily only to become casualties within hours. The German defenders, primarily elements of the 275th Infantry Division supplemented by a battalion from the 89th Infantry Division, had turned the forest into a killing ground. Their defensive positions were masterpieces of military engineering. Bunkers built with overhead cover, sufficient to survive all but direct artillery hits. Communication trenches, allowing concealed movement between positions. And fields of fire carefully cleared to create kill zones while maintaining forest cover for the defenders. But the Germans had a problem. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that they were fighting a delaying action against an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. Every man they lost was irreplaceable. Every round of ammunition expended was one less for the next battle. They couldn't afford to be overrun, but they also couldn't afford to hold positions that were being outflanked or surrounded, which meant German commanders in the Hürtgen were acutely almost paranoidly sensitive to intelligence, suggesting they were being flanked. Hartwell had learned this by listening to their communications for 2 months. He'd heard company commanders frantically reporting suspected American flanking movements, often false alarms, but always treated with immediate seriousness. He'd heard battalion headquarters ordering withdrawals based on unconfirmed reports of enemy forces in their rear. He'd heard the stress in their voices, the quick decisions made on incomplete information, the assumption that American forces were always trying to encircle them, because that's what American forces had been doing successfully for months. That fear was the weakness Hartwell intended to exploit. But it wasn't enough to simply broadcast false reports over their communication network. That would be detected. German radio operators weren't fools. They knew their own command voices, their own protocols, their own call signs. A fake order would trigger immediate verification procedures. What Hartwell needed was something that would create confusion without triggering verification. Something that would seem to confirm what German commanders were already afraid of. The idea came from his mother. Mary Hartwell had taught piano in Dayton for 20 years. She believed music was a universal language, that it could communicate emotions and ideas that transcended words. She'd taught young Jimmy that music wasn't just sound. It was psychology, emotion, and memory, all compressed into mathematical patterns of rhythm and melody. In her last letter before he'd shipped overseas, she'd written, "Remember, James, that the same song can mean completely different things to different people. Amazing grace means salvation to some and loss to others. Music is context." Context. On December 1st, while delivering supplies to a forward headquarters, Hartwell had mentioned his radio intercept work to Captain Thomas Morris, the Apple S-2 intelligence officer. Morris had been skeptical, but interested enough to listen. "So you can hear what they're saying," Morris had said. "Can you talk to them?" "Potentially," Hartwell said, "but they'd know it was fake." "What if you didn't use words?" Hartwell had stared at him. "Sir?" "Music," Morris said. "Christmas is coming. These are Christian soldiers on both sides. What if they heard Christmas carols coming from unexpected directions? What would they think?" "They'd think—" Hartwell stopped. "They'd think there were troops there, American troops, singing. Would they investigate?" "They'd report it," Hartwell said slowly. "And if their command thought there were American forces in their rear, they might withdraw," Morris finished, "or at least weaken their front to reinforce their flanks." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was the kind of psychological operation that shouldn't work, but might, because it didn't depend on the Germans believing something intellectually. It depended on them reacting instinctively to the presence of enemy forces in unexpected locations. But there was a problem. Morris was a junior captain. He couldn't authorize an operation based on musical deception without approval from higher command. And higher command, when Morris pitched the idea, had laughed him out of the briefing room. Colonel Peterson, commanding the regiment, had been blunt. "Captain, I don't have time for psychological parlor tricks. I need artillery, air support, and fresh troops. What I don't need is a goddamn Christmas concert." Morris had persisted. "Sir, we know the Germans are sensitive to flanking movements. If we can make them think—" "Make them think what? That we've surrounded them with a choir? Captain, I appreciate creative thinking, but this is combat, not a USO show. Focus on real intelligence." That should have been the end of it. But Hartwell who'd been standing outside the command tent during this conversation, had heard something in Morris's voice when the captain emerged. Not defeat, but calculation. "Hartwell," Morris had said quietly, "if someone were to test this theory without official authorization, and it worked, I imagine the colonel would be too busy enjoying the results to court-martial anyone. And if it didn't work, then that someone would probably be reassigned to a penal battalion." Morris had looked at him directly. "I can't order you to do this. I can't even officially condone it. But if you wanted to conduct an unauthorized field experiment, I might be too busy with other duties to notice." Hartwell had understood perfectly. This was off the books. This was deniable. This was his idea, his responsibility, and his ass if it failed. He'd started planning the operation that night. The technical challenges were substantial. Hartwell needed to accomplish several things simultaneously. First, he needed to identify German communication networks in the specific sector he wanted to target, the ridge line overlooking Bergstein that had stalled the American advance for 2 weeks. Second, he needed to get close enough to those positions to inject audio into their network, which meant getting within a few hundred meters of enemy lines with radio equipment. Third, he needed to broadcast audio that would sound like it was coming from multiple locations, creating the impression of widespread American presence in German rear areas. Fourth, he needed to coordinate this with actual American troops so they could exploit whatever confusion or movement resulted. And fifth, and this was the part that kept him awake at night, he needed to do all of this without getting killed. The Hurtgen Forest was not forgiving of mistakes. Hartwell spent 2 weeks preparing. He requisitioned 3 additional SCR 300 radios from his depot, claiming they were being sent for repair. He modified each one to transmit on the frequencies he'd identified for German field telephones. He practiced connecting to German networks with brief, sub-second bursts that could be attributed to atmospheric interference. He also practiced the harmonica. Hartwell had never been musical. His mother had tried to teach him piano as a child, but he'd lacked the patience. The harmonica, though, was different. It was simple, portable, and could produce surprisingly clear notes even in cold weather. More importantly, it was loud enough to be picked up clearly by a radio transmitter. He bought the harmonica from a Belgian civilian for 2 packs of cigarettes and spent every spare minute practicing Silent Night, "O come all ye faithful," and "Adeste Fidelis." The German soldiers would know these songs. They'd sung them as children, in churches, with their families. The music would be instantly recognizable, emotionally resonant, and completely unexpected in a combat zone. The psychological impact would be immediate and visceral. But Hartwell needed more than just his own harmonica playing. He needed the illusion of many voices, many locations. He recruited help. Sergeant Frank Delaney was a combat engineer who'd been helping clear mines near Hartwell's depot. Delaney was 32, a union organizer from Pittsburgh before the war, and had the kind of practical intelligence that recognized good ideas regardless of their source. When Hartwell explained what he was trying to do, Delaney had listened carefully and then said, "That's either genius or suicide, probably both. Count me in." Delaney brought Private Eddie Kowalski, a radio operator who'd been wounded in October and was still on light duty. Kowalski could monitor German frequencies and coordinate timing. He was also, improbably, a former choir singer from a Polish Catholic church in Chicago. "I can sing," Kowalski said when Hartwell explained the plan. "But why the hell are we doing this?" Because men are dying trying to take that ridge, Hartwell said, and this might save some of them. Kowalski had nodded slowly. Okay, but if we die doing this, I'm going to be really pissed. The final piece of the puzzle was positioning. Hartwell needed to be close enough to the German lines to tap into their communication network, but concealed enough to avoid being spotted. He spent 3 days studying maps and aerial reconnaissance photos, looking for a location that offered both proximity and cover. He found it. A small depression about 800 meters from the German ridgeline, just outside the range of effective small arms fire, but well within mortar range. The depression was hidden by a fallen tree and thick underbrush. And more importantly, it sat near a shallow ravine that German telephone cables followed to their forward positions. On December 22nd, Hartwell and his 2-man team moved into position under cover of darkness, carrying their modified radios, their harmonica, 3 days of rations, and a prayer that this would work. December 24th, 1944, was brutally cold. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow had been falling steadily since noon. The snow was both blessing and curse. It muffled sound, making communication difficult, but also making movement harder to detect. The forest was utterly still, frozen into temporary silence. Hartwell, Delaney, and Kowalski had been in position for 2 days. They'd monitored German radio traffic continuously, mapping communication patterns and identifying key nodes. Kowalski had compiled a list of call signs, frequencies, and typical message traffic. The Germans on the ridge were from the 275th Infantry Division, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Company, 73 men, according to the last count, dug into positions that had repelled 4 American assaults. The Germans were tired. Hartwell could hear it in their radio communications, conversations about dwindling ammunition, complaints about the cold, references to when the Americans attack again, spoken with fatalistic resignation. These were men who knew they were holding an exposed position, who knew they were outnumbered, who knew their survival depended on the Americans not finding a way to flank them. Perfect psychological conditions. At 1900 hours, 7 p.m., Hartwell heard something unexpected on the German frequency. Singing. Faint at first, then stronger. The Germans in their bunkers were singing Christmas carols. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. The same song that existed in English. The same melody that would be instantly recognizable to both sides. Hartwell looked at Delaney, who was grinning despite the cold. "They're doing our work for us," Delaney whispered. "They're already thinking about Christmas, about home, about not being here. Their heads aren't in the fight. Which means they'll be even more rattled when they hear singing from the wrong direction," Kowalski added. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. At precisely 23:45 hours, 11:45 p.m., Hartwell would begin playing Silent Night on his harmonica, while transmitting directly into the German communication network. The Germans would hear it on their field telephones, seemingly coming from their own communication system. Simultaneously, Kowalski would create brief burst transmissions on adjacent frequencies, creating acoustic echoes that would suggest multiple sources. The Germans would report it. They had to. Protocol demanded reporting any unusual activity. Those reports would go to company headquarters, then battalion, where officers would have to make decisions based on incomplete information at night during a snowstorm. The critical factor was timing. Hartwell had coordinated with Captain Morris, unofficially, deniably, to have American forces ready to probe the German positions at 0015 hours, 30 minutes after the musical transmission. If the Germans had pulled men back to investigate the phantom flanking force, the probing attack would find weaknesses. If the Germans had simply become confused and disorganized, the American attack might achieve surprise. And if the Germans hadn't reacted at all, then a lot of effort would have been wasted, and Hartwell would be explaining his unauthorized operation to very angry officers. At 2300 hours, 1100 p.m., Hartwell made final preparations. He checked his harmonica, blowing softly to ensure the reeds were working despite the cold. He verified radio connections. He synchronized watches with Kowalski and Delaney. "You know," Delaney said quietly, "this is completely insane." "I know," Hartwell replied. "And if it works, you'll have invented a whole new kind of warfare." "I know that too. And if it doesn't work, we're sitting 800 meters from German lines with radio equipment that's about to broadcast our exact position." Hartwell smiled thinly. "That's why I brought you two. Someone needs to drag my body back if this goes wrong." "You're a real comedian, Hartwell," Kowalski muttered. At 2330, Hartwell put on his headphones and began monitoring German communications. Normal traffic. Position reports. Someone complaining about the cold. Someone else talking about a letter from home. Human voices. Speaking German. Belonging to men who were someone's son or brother or father. For a moment, Hartwell felt the weight of what he was about to do. These men were the enemy, yes, but they were also just men, far from home, doing what they'd been ordered to do. And he was about to attempt to manipulate them, to use their emotions and fears and Christmas memories as weapons against them. War was full of moral complexities that looked simple in newsreels, but felt horrible up close. Then he thought about the American soldiers who would attack at 0015, and how many fewer of them might die if this worked. He thought about the medics he'd watched carry wounded men past his depot. The screaming and the blood and the terrible mathematics of combat that counted lives in casualty reports. Someone was going to die in the Hurtgen forest. That was inevitable. But maybe, just maybe, fewer people would die if he did this correctly. At 2345 hours, Hartwell nodded to Kowalski, who flipped switches on the modified radio sets. Electromagnetic connections formed, invisible bridges linking Allied equipment to German communication lines through electromagnetic coupling and frequency overlap. Hartwell raised the harmonica to his lips. His hands were shaking, from cold, from fear, from the sheer audacity of what he was attempting. He began to play. The first notes of Silent Night emerged thin and wavering from the harmonica. Hartwell's fingers were stiff with cold, and he mentally cursed himself for not warming the instrument more thoroughly. But then, muscle memory took over. Weeks of practice in his tent, on guard duty, any moment he could steal. And the melody became clearer. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. He played it slowly, the way the Germans had been singing it earlier. Not rushed, not martial, but contemplative and sad. The melody carried weight, emotional resonance that transcended language. This was a song about peace, about hope, about a silent night long ago, when something divine had entered a dark world. It was also, in this context, psychologically devastating. Through his headphones, Hartwell heard the immediate German reaction. "Was ist das? What is that?" A pause. Confused voices. Das kommt vom Telefon. It's coming from the telephone. Stille, hören Sie. Quiet. Listen. More voices, urgent now. The music had stopped normal radio traffic cold. Everyone was listening. Hartwell kept playing. 30 seconds. 45 seconds. He reached the end of the first verse and began the second, his breath controlled and steadied despite his racing heart. Kowalski, monitoring 3 separate German frequencies, was scribbling notes frantically. He held up a page. Multiple units reporting it. They're confused. On the German radio net, Hartwell could hear officers demanding reports. Wo kommt das her? Where is that coming from? Ich weiß es nicht, Herr Leutnant. Es klingt wie es überall ist. I don't know, Lieutenant. It sounds like it's everywhere. That was the critical moment. The moment when perception became reality. The Germans were hearing this music on their military communication network, their secure, closed system, which meant it was coming from inside their defensive perimeter, or behind it, or possibly multiple locations, which meant American forces had infiltrated their positions. Or that's what it could mean. Human psychology in combat operates on assumptions and worst-case scenarios. When something inexplicable happens, especially at night, in bad weather, when visibility is poor and nerves are already stretched, soldiers don't reason through all possible explanations. They react to the most dangerous possibility. Hartwell played for 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was profound. Through his headphones, frantic German voices. Haben Sie das gehört? Did you hear that? Melden Sie es sofort. Report it immediately. Es könnten Amerikaner in unserem Rücken sein. There could be Americans behind us. Bingo. Kowalski was listening to battalion frequency now. He scribbled. Battalion is questioning company. Company doesn't know what to report. Officers are trying to figure out if they're being flanked. 5 minutes passed. 10. The German radio traffic was chaotic. Reports, counter-reports, officers demanding clarification. Junior officers trying to provide answers they didn't have. At 23:55, Hartwell played again. This time, slightly different. He played O Come All Ye Faithful, Adeste Fidelis, in Latin. But the melody was universal. He played for 90 seconds, then stopped. The German reaction was even more intense. Es kommt von verschiedenen Richtungen. It's coming from different directions. Das sind mehrere Einheiten. That's multiple units. They were hearing what they expected to hear, interpreting the same music broadcast through their communication network as evidence of multiple American positions. Confirmation bias was doing Hartwell's work for him. At midnight exactly, 00s and hours, Hartwell played one final time. Silent Night again. But this time, he played it while Kowalski created intentional interference patterns that made the audio phase in and out, creating the acoustic illusion of movement, of sources changing position. To the Germans, it sounded like American forces were maneuvering through their rear areas while singing Christmas carols. It sounded insane. It sounded terrifying. Through the darkness and snow, Hartwell heard something new. Voices carried on the wind from the German positions. Not radio voices, actual human voices, shouting. Orders being given. Movement. Delaney, watching through a night scope, whispered urgently. They're repositioning. I count... Jesus. at least 20 men moving back from the ridgeline. They're reinforcing their rear, which meant the German front line was now undermanned. At 0010 hours, 5 minutes before the scheduled American probe, Hartwell transmitted one last message. Not music this time, just sound. German voices he'd recorded earlier, fragmentary and distorted, played backwards through the frequency shifts to create an unsettling, almost supernatural audio effect. Was Zum Teufel? What the hell? The German radio net descended into chaos. At 0015 hours, American forces from the 28th Infantry Division launched their probing attack on the German ridgeline. What they found was not the impenetrable defense that had repelled 4 previous assaults. They found confusion. They found undermanned positions. They found Germans who believed they were being surrounded, who were looking over their shoulders instead of watching their front, who were psychologically off balance and tactically disorganized. The American probe, expecting heavy resistance, instead achieved a breakthrough. By 0045 hours, elements of 2 companies had penetrated the German defensive line. By 0200 hours, the ridge that had cost hundreds of American lives was in Allied hands. The Germans retreated in disorder, some units never receiving withdrawal orders because their communication network was still disrupted by phantom music and unexplained audio. 73 German soldiers had been on that ridge. By morning, 42 were captured, 15 were killed in the fighting, and 16 escaped into the forest. The position that had held for 2 weeks fell in less than 2 hours. In the depression, 800 meters from the former German line, Hartwell carefully packed his harmonica into its case, while Kowalski monitored increasingly frantic German radio traffic from retreating units trying to re-establish order. "You know," Delaney said, his voice filled with something like awe, "you just won a battle with a harmonica and a radio." Hartwell didn't respond immediately. He was listening to the sounds of combat fading into the distance, the occasional rifle shot and the shouts of American soldiers securing positions. He was thinking about the German soldier whose voice he'd heard singing Silent Night at 1900 hours, and whether that man was among the captured or the dead. "We won a battle," Hartwell said finally, "but the war's not over." "No," Delaney agreed. "But tomorrow morning, Colonel Peterson is going to want to know why the Germans collapsed so fast. And Captain Morris is going to have to explain. And then, Corporal Hartwell, you're going to have to do this again." Hartwell looked at his harmonica case, at the modified radios, at the notes Kowalski had taken documenting every moment of the operation. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I suppose I am." Dawn, on Christmas Day, 1944, revealed the full scope of what had happened. The German positions on the ridge were a chaotic mess. Abandoned equipment, scattered personal items, hastily vacated bunkers. American intelligence officers moved through the captured positions, documenting everything, trying to piece together why such a strong defensive position had collapsed so quickly. Hartwell, Delaney, and Kowalski were summoned to regimental headquarters at 0800 hours. They walked into the command tent, expecting anything from commendations to court-martials. Colonel Peterson was there. So was Captain Morris, wearing an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. Also present were a major from Division Intelligence, a lieutenant colonel from Corps Headquarters, and a civilian in a suit who was introduced only as Mr. Wallace from Washington. Peterson spoke first. "Corporal Hartwell, Last night, the German defensive positions that had stalled our advance for 2 weeks collapsed with minimal casualties on our side. Captain Morris has informed me that this was the result of an unconventional operation that you planned and executed, without authorization. Hartwell came to attention. Yes, sir. Explain. So Hartwell explained. The radio intercepts, the technical analysis of German communication equipment, the psychological assessment, the Christmas Carol deception, the precise timing coordinated with American assault forces. He explained it all in clear, factual terms, avoiding any attempts to dramatize or minimize what he'd done. When he finished, there was silence in the tent. Peterson looked at Morris. Captain, did you authorize this operation? No, sir. I was unaware Corporal Hartwell intended to conduct this field experiment. The lie was transparent. Everyone in the tent knew Morris had quietly enabled the operation. But the plausible deniability was there. Peterson turned back to Hartwell. Corporal, what you did was reckless, unauthorized, and completely outside your assigned duties. It also saved American lives and achieved an objective that conventional methods had failed to accomplish. He paused. It was also brilliant. The major from Division Intelligence leaned forward. Corporal, I need detailed technical documentation of everything you did. Radio frequencies, equipment modifications, timing, audio content, all of it. And I need you to assess whether this technique can be replicated in other sectors. It can, Hartwell said. But it depends on several factors: enemy psychology, communication infrastructure, tactical situation. It won't work everywhere, but where conditions are right, yes, it can work again. Mr. Wallace from Washington spoke for the first time. Corporal, how much do you know about psychological warfare? Only what I've read in field manuals, sir. Would you be interested in learning more? In a formal capacity? Hartwell blinked. Sir? The Office of Strategic Services has been developing irregular warfare techniques. What you did last night, using enemy communication systems against them, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, coordinating deception with conventional operations, that's precisely the kind of innovation we're trying to develop systematically. We could use someone with your particular combination of technical knowledge and tactical creativity. Sir, I'm a supply clerk. Not anymore, Peterson said. Effective immediately. You're assigned to Division Intelligence with the provisional rank of sergeant. Your new duties involve developing and implementing psychological operations in support of combat operations. Captain Morris will provide administrative oversight. Morris smiled slightly. It seems, Sergeant Hartwell, that your unauthorized experiment has been retroactively authorized. Over the next week, Hartwell's operation was analyzed, documented, and distributed through intelligence channels. The technique acquired a designation: Audio Deception Protocol, Hartwell Method. A training program was developed. Equipment was modified and produced in quantity. Hartwell trained other soldiers, sharing what he'd learned about German communication systems, psychological vulnerabilities, and the effective use of sound as a weapon. The Christmas Carol operation, as it became known, was repeated in modified form 7 more times before the war ended in May 1945. It didn't always work. German forces eventually learned to be skeptical of unexplained audio on their communication networks. But when it did work, it saved lives and created tactical opportunities. But the broader impact was psychological and institutional. Hartwell had demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected sources. that technical knowledge, combined with tactical creativity, could produce results that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. He'd shown that psychological operations, properly executed, could be as effective as artillery. He'd also shown that the Army's rigid credentialing system sometimes overlooked talent, and that genius could wear a supply clerk's uniform. After the war, James Hartwell returned to Dayton, Ohio. He didn't talk much about his service. When pressed, he'd mention that he'd been in supply services initially, then transferred to intelligence work. He didn't mention the Christmas Carol operation. He didn't mention that his techniques had been studied, copied, and incorporated into military doctrine. He went to college on the GI Bill, studying electrical engineering. He worked for his father's company for a few years, then moved to RCA, where he helped develop early television broadcasting equipment. He married, had 3 children, lived a quiet suburban life. His mother, Mary Hartwell, lived until 1963. Before she died, he told her about Christmas Eve, 1944, about playing Silent Night on a harmonica through a German communication network, about using music as a weapon, about how her lessons about music being psychology and context had saved lives in the Hurtgen Forest. She'd smiled and said, "I always knew music was powerful, James. I just never imagined it could win battles." "It didn't win the battle," he'd replied. "It created an opportunity. The soldiers still had to fight, but maybe fewer of them died because of what I did. That's all anyone can do," she'd said. "Create opportunities. The rest is up to others." James Hartwell died in 1997 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II and his career in electrical engineering. It didn't mention the Hurtgen Forest. It didn't mention that he'd invented a new form of psychological warfare with a harmonica and a captured radio manual. But in certain military circles, his story endured. At the Army War College, instructors teaching psychological operations still reference the Christmas Carol operation as a case study in innovation and psychological exploitation. In intelligence services, Hartwell's approach, technical analysis combined with psychological assessment, is taught as fundamental methodology. Veterans of the Hurtgen Forest who survived that Christmas day still tell stories about the corporal who used music to confuse the Germans, though most of them never learned his name. The broader lesson of Hartwell's story isn't about music or radios or Christmas carols. It's about the nature of innovation in institutional contexts. The Army's formal system had dismissed him, a supply clerk with no formal intelligence training, no combat experience, no credentials that suggested tactical genius. The system was designed to value rank, experience, and credentials. But the system didn't account for curiosity, for the ability to see connections others missed, for the willingness to experiment with ideas that seemed absurd. It didn't account for someone who could look at captured enemy equipment and see not just technical specifications, but psychological vulnerabilities. It didn't account for someone who would risk court-martial to test an idea that might save lives. In that sense, Hartwell's story is about the eternal tension between institutional authority and individual innovation, about how the best ideas sometimes come from the least expected sources, about how genius doesn't always wear the right uniform or hold the right rank, and about how sometimes, in the middle of history's bloodiest war, in a frozen forest where thousands died for each kilometer of ground, a supply clerk with a harmonica could change the outcome of a battle by making the enemy hear ghosts singing Christmas carols. In the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there exists a classified file, recently declassified, designated Psychological Operations European Theater Case Study 47B Audio Deception Techniques. The file contains Hartwell's original technical notes, transcripts of German radio intercepts, after-action reports from the operations that used his methods, and a detailed analysis written by OSS officers in 1945. The file's conclusion reads, Sergeant Hartwell's innovation represents a paradigm shift in psychological warfare methodology. By exploiting enemy communication infrastructure to deliver psychologically resonant audio content, he demonstrated that technical knowledge and psychological insight can create tactical effects disproportionate to resource investment. The Christmas Carol operation achieved with 3 men and improvised equipment what artillery bombardment and infantry assault had failed to accomplish at significant cost in lives and material. More significantly, this operation demonstrates the importance of cultivating innovation at all levels of military organization. Hartwell possessed no formal intelligence training, no advanced degrees, no credentials that would have identified him as a potential innovator. His contribution emerged from curiosity, technical aptitude, and willingness to experiment with unconventional approaches. Military organizations must develop systems that identify and enable such innovation, regardless of source. The Hartwell method has been incorporated into psychological operations doctrine and will remain relevant as long as adversaries depend on communication networks susceptible to exploitation. But the broader lesson transcends specific techniques. Genius can emerge from unexpected places, and instituting untold flexibility in recognizing and empowering innovation is itself a strategic advantage. The report is signed by a colonel whose name is still redacted, even in the declassified version. But the signature block includes one handwritten addition. No formal credentials, no command authority, no traditional training, just observation, ingenuity, and courage. That's all it took to change a battle. Remember that. On December 25th, 1944, in the Hurtgen Forest, a supply clerk proved that the most powerful weapon in war is sometimes the human capacity for innovation. That lesson, like the haunting melody of Silent Night played through enemy communication lines, endures across decades. They never doubted him again. His technique was simple, but his legend endures.